Ms. Rahayu Mazam, Guest of Honor and Minister of State for the Ministry of Digital Development and Information and Ministry of Health. Professor Kishore Mahbubani, the 26th Gordon Arthur Ransome Orator, Masters of the Academy of Medicine of Singapore and of Malaysia, and President of the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine. Council members, fellow academicians, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Kishore Mahbubani's careers, which span more than 5 decades, may be summed up in 2 words: public service. Within this is an impressive saga of challenges, achievements, and recognition, not just for Professor Mahbubani himself, but for Singapore. After graduating with first-class honors in philosophy from the University of Singapore, Kishore joined the Foreign Service as a Foreign Service officer in 1971. We should remember that Singapore then was poor, unknown, and very young. And so that in itself was a very challenging post. But Kishore had an early baptism of fire, literally. He was posted to war-torn Cambodia, and Phnom Penh, the capital, was shelled almost daily. I believe his residence also got a hit. But his ability, his courage, and his dedication to duty was duly noted, and he was posted to key locations such as Malaysia, the US, and twice as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. He also, while with the UN, served as the president of the UN Security Council twice also. And he reached the peak of the Foreign Service as the permanent secretary, after which he was conferred the Public Administration Medal Gold in 1998. After this illustrious career in diplomacy, Kishore took on a new challenge as founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in August 2004. This is the first institution that Mr. Lee permitted to be named after him during his lifetime, because he recognized its importance to Singapore's future. Fortunately, the school fulfilled its high expectations within 5 years and was admitted into an elite group, the Global Public Policy Network. Under Kishore's guidance, when he left 13 years later from the deanship, the school had become well endowed academically, financially, and reputationally. But despite all these stellar achievements, Kishore is best known to us and internationally as an author, thinker, and commentator on geopolitical affairs. His 9 books to date and many articles often have very provocative titles. Can Asians think? Can Singapore survive? Has the West lost it? And has China won? But these are more than just catchy titles. He poses difficult questions in order to provoke thought and work towards solutions. And for this, he has garnered global recognition for his intellectual contributions. For example, he has been listed several times by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazine as one of the top 100 global thinkers, and by the Financial Times as one of the top 50 individuals who would shape the future of capitalism. Kishore, of course, has received many international awards and honors, including the US Foreign Policy Association Medal, and he was also elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019, the second Singaporean to get this honor. Of course, we know who the first one was. Kishore has served and continues to serve on many globally significant boards, and often as chair, both in Singapore and internationally. But his greatest challenge in life, arguably, was during childhood, as he had to overcome an impoverished and disadvantaged childhood, which, as his fellow academic and diplomat, Professor Chan Hing-chi, described as a story of fierce survival and grit on borrowed optimism. Kishore himself modestly attributes his success to the fact that he was born in Singapore and grew up in Singapore. When he was awarded the President's Scholarship in 1967, this transformed his career prospects from that of a textile salesman because it enabled him to attend university and continue to help support his mother and 3 sisters at the same time. He says that if the scholarship sum had been less than his salary as a textile salesman, he might not have accepted the scholarship. Fortunately, he did. There are many more fascinating stories about Kishore, which I do not have time to go into, but fortunately, his memoir, Living the Asian Century, will be released in August this year, next month. But what of us? What of the medical profession? Can we continue to improve the health, both physical and mental, of our fellow humans in a VUCA world with existential threats such as climate change, pandemics, and exponential technological changes, all of which already pose dilemmas, including ethical ones for humanity? We too need to ask ourselves difficult questions and find solutions. As you have heard, Professor Ransome himself was a famous diagnostician who believed that asking the right questions was essential. We need the humanities as well as the sciences. We need to think with the heart as well as the head. We need to ask why as well as how, and to listen to the personal narrative as well as the facts. We need to balance idealism and realism, and to see the global big picture as well as have an eye for the critical detail. Ladies and gentlemen, it is therefore my privilege to present such a person as the 26th Gordon Arthur Ransome Orator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gaming, for this thoroughly heartfelt and illuminating citation on Professor Kishore Mahbubani. It is with great honor that I now invite Professor Kishore Mahbubani to deliver the 26th Gordon Arthur Ransome Oration entitled, Can Humanity Rise Up to Face Its Next Existential Challenge?
Thank you, Gaimin. That was a truly warm and generous introduction. My only fear is that she may have raised your expectations a bit too high. But thank you. Minister of State, Rahayu Mahazam, Masters of the Academies of Medicine of Singapore, Malaysia, and President of the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's truly a great honor to be asked to deliver the 26th Gordon Arthur Ransome Oration. As you all have heard, Professor Ransome was instrumental to the development of field of medicine in Singapore. Besides being a legendary physician himself, he laid the groundwork for Singapore's excellent postgraduate medical education, and he was a revered mentor to many of our senior medical practitioners. From what I've read, he was a paragon of compassion, excellence, and as Gaimin mentioned, public service. The present excellence of our medical community in Singapore is part of his legacy, and we all owe him a debt of gratitude. And I'm glad that his memory lives on through this oration, and I'm humbled to be selected to deliver it this year. Yet, the success of Professor Ransome in his field was not just the result of one outstanding individual working hard. He was an intellectual child of the great Western School of Medicine, which was also part of a larger edifice of Western intellectual traditions of rationality and the scientific method. The Wikipedia description of Western culture states that, and I quote, "A cornerstone of Western thought, beginning in ancient Greece and continuing through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, is the idea of rationalism in various spheres of life, developed by Hellenistic philosophy, scholasticism, and humanism. Empiricism later gave rise to the scientific method, the scientific revolution, and the age of enlightenment," unquote. Notice the emphasis on empiricism and rationalism, two dimensions of Western civilization which I will speak about a great deal in this lecture. Indeed, rationalism and empiricism are two key pillars of Western civilization which helped the West develop great advances in technology during the Industrial Revolution and shoot ahead of all the other great civilizations in the world to dominate the world for over 200 years. And a key reason today why the other civilizations, especially in Asia, are catching up with the West in the 21st century is that we have also embraced the great Western traditions of empiricism and rationalism. This also explains why Singapore is now becoming one of the best places in the world in the field of Western medicine. So all this would suggest that humanity at large is converging on using the great Western methods of rationalism and empiricism in solving the great global challenges of our times. Intellectually, yes, there's some degree of convergence. Politically, there isn't. Indeed, in the face of one of the greatest existential challenges faced by humanity, especially climate change, humanity is doing the opposite. We are abandoning rationalism and empiricism and going back to our irrational, pre-modern, tribal instincts. Now, this is a very strong statement to make. Please let me use a simple boat analogy to explain the gravity of the situation faced by humanity. In my book, The Great Convergence, I explain that the forces of globalization over the past few centuries have essentially shrunk planet Earth and transformed the human condition. In the past, when we lived in 193 separate countries, as we do today, it was like living in 193 separate boats. If one boat caught COVID, other boats wouldn't catch COVID. But the world has shrunk. We now live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And so this explains why, when one cabin on our boat caught COVID, all of humanity in all 193 cabins caught COVID. The evidence is clear. Humanity now lives on one boat. And we just saw this 2 days ago. One Microsoft glitch. Guess what? Airports around the world shut down. That's how interconnected we are. Yet, we are in the same boat. And what would be the best name to give to this boat? Fortunately, there's a very appropriate name. We should call it the Titanic. Why the Titanic? Because amazingly, we now know without a shadow of doubt that our boat is heading towards an iceberg called climate change. Let me stress here, since I spoke about rationalism and empiricism, that the scientific evidence is clear and undeniable. According to the UN's emission gap report, unless humanity comes together and changes course, we will be heading towards a global environmental disaster. Based on current trends, the global temperature is likely to rise nearly 3 degrees over the pre-industrial average this century, far above the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. According to the UN, the resulting impact of a 3-degree rise in global temperatures will be a world in which 3.25 billion people, or 40% of the world's population, will be exposed to lethal levels of heat and humidity. There'll be severe drought and water shortages. Food production will fall rapidly. 50% of marine life and a third of terrestrial life would go extinct, causing ecosystems to collapse, and there is also a high risk of irreversible changes to fragile natural systems like the Arctic and Amazon. And there could be a catastrophic sea level rise, causing many areas to be permanently flooded and displacing millions of people. In addition, extreme weather events such as heat waves, cyclones, bushfires, storms, and floods could all become increasingly common and severe. The evidence for all this is undeniable. Now here, as I said earlier, fortunately, humanity has embraced the great Western traditions of rationalism and empiricism. We can all come together and agree on what is coming. We can all intellectually agree on what should be done to be safe planet Earth and humanity. Indeed, the UN report found that the predicted 2030 greenhouse gas emissions must fall by 42% to achieve the 1.5 degrees centigrade warming threshold. And the UN report says this will require immediate, accelerated, and relentless actions to reduce emissions, such as preventing the use of fossil fuels, switching to renewable energy, and finding ways to reduce energy consumption and waste, including by improving the energy efficiency of our infrastructure, supply chains, and manufacturing processes. We must also actively remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, such as by protecting and restoring existing carbon sinks, such as the oceans and forests, planting new forests, and developing carbon capture technologies. It's also important to adapt to the effects of climate change, such as by reinforcing close coastlines, growing crops that will fare better in the changing climate, protecting infrastructure against extreme weather events, and planning for the shifts in water and food supplies. So we know the answers. Science has given us the answers. We, intelligent humanity, we know what to do. So, since all the great scientific minds agree on what should be done, humanity at large should heed their advice and start working together to implement the solutions. If humanity was truly an intelligent species, we would immediately implement them. Sadly, the only confident prediction I can make about the future is that humanity will not come together to deal with climate change. In short, I predict, and hold me to this, that humanity will abandon rationalism and empiricism in dealing with climate change. And I can tell you that future historians will marvel that our current generation of human beings, which are by and large better educated than previous generations. Even 100 years ago, you wouldn't have seen scenes like this, the spread of excellence in so many fields. Yet, despite this, we are not coming together to deal with an obvious existential challenge. And future historians will ask, why did we not do so? The simple, honest answer is that even though humanity has advanced in the realms of rationalism and empiricism, we are also influenced by pre-modern tribal instincts that continue to influence human behavior even in advanced Western societies. And there are at least three pre-modern forces, which, by the way, have been part of the human condition for thousands of years, that are pulling humanity back. And given how dangerous these forces are, I hope you'll give me some time to spell them out. And I say this with some trepidation, knowing that I stand between you and dinner. But please bear with me, because these are amazingly powerful forces that can overcome rationality. And the first is geopolitics. The second is a concept of tribal solidarity called sovereignty. And the third is the desire of the leading civilization to preserve its dominance like a dominant tribe of apes in the jungle, unwilling to cede territory. Sadly, I'm not exaggerating. As I said, let me explain briefly these forces. The easiest one to explain is geopolitics. Simple common sense tells us that humanity can only come together to cooperate and deal with climate change if the two greatest powers, who have by far the two largest economies in the world, the US and China, come together to cooperate. Indeed, the last time the humanity actually came together to effectively cooperate on climate change was in 2015, when the US and China were led by Obama and Xi Jinping. And I met recently in Singapore, I think about a month or so ago, a close colleague of President Barack Obama, who told me that Barack Obama was delighted that China had chosen a strong leader like Xi Jinping, because Obama was shrewd enough to realize that only a strong counterpart leader in China could make the major political compromises needed to reach a deal. And this is what happened. The US and China came together in 2015, made major compromises, and we agreed on the Paris Climate Accords. Now, as you know, almost 10 years have passed. Essentially, the Paris Agreement has not been implemented. Indeed, the 2023 Global Stocktake, which you can find, by the way, on the UN Climate Change website, concluded that the current trajectory of global emissions is not consistent with limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, including when all climate action plans are considered. Adaptation to climate change is also not at the levels needed, and the world is experiencing increased losses from extreme climate events. And the report says the growing needs for climate action do not match current support available and mobilized, and the gap is widening. In short, we have not implemented the Paris Accords. Why not? Here the reasons are complex, but some clearly stand out. Obama, as you know, was succeeded by Donald Trump, who has repeatedly said that climate change is a hoax and whose administration scaled back many measures to fight climate change. And I'm very sorry to inform you that the chances of Donald Trump coming back, unfortunately, are very high. But it's not about one person. Please don't think that the problem will be removed if you just get rid of Donald Trump. It's much deeper. It's deeper because the United States has decided, and this goes back to my pre-modern tribal instincts, the US has decided that keeping China back and preventing it from overtaking the US as a preeminent economic power is more important than cooperating with China to save planet Earth and humanity. As you can see, this is a very strong claim to make. This is why I wrote an entire book, Has China Won, which gave me mention, to explain why the US-China geopolitical contest will definitely accelerate over the next decade or two. And if that happens, as I predict, we can say goodbye to global cooperation against climate change. And let me give you some concrete examples of irrationality. In 2022, 58% of America's 130 million households had 2 or more cars. There are about 500 million Chinese households now. If each Chinese middle-class household had 2 or 3 gasoline-driven cars, greenhouse gas emissions would skyrocket. Thankfully, China is instead the largest market for electric vehicles with 8 million EVs sold in China in 2023, compared to just 1.4 million in the US. Poorer China does better on EVs than richer America. By switching to EVs, China significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions and therefore contributed to the fight against climate change. Now, the scientific evidence shows that if more of us adopt EVs, it'd be good for climate change. And the fact that China has developed a competitive EV industry is therefore a global asset. And the Chinese did this because they invested in this as early as 2001. So therefore, if you want to fight climate change, the logical, rational thing to do would be for American and European companies to cooperate with Chinese companies to strengthen their own EV industry. Instead, as you know, even in the past few months, the US has imposed tariffs on Chinese EVs, Europe has imposed tariffs on Chinese EVs, and as a result, there'll be a delay in the transition to EVs, creating another major setback to the fight against climate change. In short, as a result of geopolitics, pushing down China is more important than saving planet Earth. This is how rational humanity is. Let me turn now to the second force preventing global cooperation on climate change. And here, there's a primitive concept of tribal solidarity called sovereignty. Now, trying to explain how this concept holds back humanity is actually going to be difficult, especially in a short lecture like this. And I must emphasize that some aspects of sovereignty remain positive. Exhibit A, Singapore. Why has Singapore succeeded so spectacularly since we became independent on August 9, 1965? Many reasons, including exceptional leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. Still, one absolutely essential condition is that we achieve independence and we develop sovereignty. No Singaporean is prepared to surrender or give up the sovereignty of Singapore. What is true of Singapore is true of all the other 192 countries in the world. Yet, paradoxically, if climate change gets out of control, Singapore will effectively lose its sovereignty to a rising ocean. The NEA projects that the mean sea level around Singapore will rise by 0.23 to 1.15 meters by the end of the century, and if emissions remain high, it could rise by around 2 meters by 2150. In the event of extreme weather events, sea levels could rise by a further 4 to 5 meters. This would be catastrophic for Singapore, as about 30% of our island is less than 5 meters above sea level. And as you know, if there's no physical territory, there's no sovereignty. So it's therefore in Singapore's interest to cooperate with the world, with the rest of the world to fight climate change. Then Singapore, as you know, is ready to cooperate. However, other countries are not, including some of the richest countries. And here I'm going to make some slightly provocative points. Many Western countries try to portray themselves as saints on the climate change issue while describing the emerging economies as sinners. The Western states state correctly that their current flows of greenhouse gas emissions have been diminishing while the current flows of emerging economies like China and India have been increasing. This is true. Yet, climate change isn't happening today just because of the current flows of greenhouse gas emissions. It is also happening because of the stock of greenhouse gas emissions that the world, especially the Western industrialized countries, have put in the atmosphere since the great industrial revolution of the 19th century. Here, it would be good to compare the stock, for example, that the 7 wealthy G7 countries have put in the atmosphere, let's say, compared to the BRICS emerging economies. And what is shocking is that the wealthy G7 countries, who only make up 10% of the world's population, are responsible for 43% of greenhouse gas emissions. 10% of population, 43% greenhouse gas emissions. And the BRICS countries, who make up 45% of the world's population, have only contributed 27% to greenhouse gas emissions. And an even fairer comparison would be to compare contributions on a per capita basis. The UN emissions report noted that the United States of America accounts for 4% of current world population, but has contributed 17% of global warming from 1850 to 2021. India, by contrast, accounts for 18% of the world's population, but to date has only contributed 5% of global warming. Therefore, the average in Chinese and Indian has contributed 9.8 tons for the average Chinese, 2.9 tons or 3 tons for the average Indian to tons of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere in 2022. By contrast, to take 2 of the wealthiest countries in the world, especially natural resources, the average Australian and Canadian contributed 22 and 20%. China 10, India 3, Australia 22, Canada 20 tons. So clearly, to fight climate change, humanity has to collectively sacrifice. But how do we assign what portions to sacrifice? An independent and objective tribunal, if it acted fairly, would recommend that the wealthier Western countries who have contributed more to the stock of greenhouse gas emissions should be asked to make greater sacrifices. That would be fair. Sadly, and this is another key problem, the logic of democratic selection of leaders in the West makes countries selfish, and therefore they cannot sacrifice. Indeed, in private, Western leaders agree that they should do more. As Jean-Claude Juncker, the former president of the European Commission, famously said, and I quote him, "We all know what to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected once we have done it." Democracy and sovereignty go hand in hand. And he was one of the few Western leaders to confess that the short-term interests of the electorate trumped any responsible long-term policies. And what protects countries from external pressures to change? It's a concept of sovereignty. Now, having said that, please let me add that I don't see the concept of sovereignty disappearing anytime soon. It will certainly carry on for the rest of my lifetime. Does that mean we are doomed? Not totally. Without totally sacrificing all our sovereignty, we can sacrifice some of it and strengthen institutions of global governance that could help to save a planet in distress. Given our common interest in saving planet Earth, and if we used our great traditions of rationalism and empiricism to look for solutions. Humanity should be coming together to strengthen institutions of global governance. The solution is obvious. Are we doing that? Sadly, we are doing the opposite. We are weakening institutions of global governance. So this brings me to the third structural force that is preventing global cooperation: the desire of the West to retain its domination of key international organizations and preserve the privileges from a bygone era. Now, I know that many of you must be thinking, it would be rational for you to do so, that I'm being too harsh on the West. Fortunately, I've explained my case at great length in my book, The Great Convergence, on why it has been unwise for the West to resist structural changes in the global multilateral order. And here's a very brief summary of the argument. Most major international organizations fall under the umbrella of the United Nations. In most UN organizations, decisions are taken on the basis of one country, one vote. Since the Western countries form a minority, and by the way, the West makes up 12% of the world's population, the West gets outvoted in the UN. And since they cannot control the UN, the West therefore weakens the UN. And it weakens them by depriving them of reliable long-term funding. Now, I'm not exaggerating. Let's take the World Health Organization. Now, we have all just been through COVID. We all know how important global cooperation in dealing with pandemics is. The logical thing, therefore, is that we should be strengthening the World Health Organization day by day, year by year, decade by decade. Guess what have we been doing to the WHO? Look at this data. In 1970-71, over 50 years ago, in the WHO budget, 62% of its budget came from mandatory SS contributions. Why are mandatory SS contributions important? Because this is guaranteed long-term funding. And the WHO can only recruit health inspectors and doctors and scientists from mandatory long-term funding, because you know it's going to be there year after year, not from voluntary funding that changes year by year. So we should logically be increasing the mandatory contributions to the World Health Organization. So guess what we have done in 50 years? We've gone from a situation where 62% of the budget came from mandatory funding to now only 16%. Isn't that shocking? How does an organization develop long-term muscles from when 16% of its budget? And I can tell you that if you have any doubts, look at a book by Professor Kelly Lee, a professor of global health governance at Simon Fraser University. She provides all the data. But here, since I'm going to be depressing you, let me just inject a very small piece of good news, which I was very surprised to hear, that the West finally realized that reducing SS contributions was a disaster. Apparently, in 2022, the WHO finally said, okay, let's raise it to 50%. So that's been one small change. However, this minor improvement in the funding of WHO does not signal a U-turn from the policies of the West to weaken UN-based multilateral organizations. These policies continue. I should also explain that one key reason why I can speak confidently about the systematic efforts of the West to weaken institutions of global governance is that when I was the Singapore ambassador to the UN for 10 years, as Gaimin said, I was there in the trenches, deep in the trenches, in the subcommittees, watching these fights taking place. And I knew exactly what the West was trying to do. But to me, what was even more shocking was when I was appointed a member of the Commission of Eminent Persons to review the future of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, under the presidency of the former president of Mexico. I was shocked to discover that the West was also trying to weaken the IAEA, even though we all know that nuclear proliferation is another huge danger that humanity faces. Even the budget of the IAEA was being squeezed. So, at the same time, I want to emphasize a key point here. What I would tell my Western friends in the UN was, what you are doing is also not in the interest of the West. You are undermining your own long-term interests by undermining institutions of global governance. And fortunately, there are some voices in the West arguing for a more rational approach for multilateral organizations. One of the few leaders to do so was the former President of the United States, President Bill Clinton. In a speech he gave at Yale in 2003, he said, and I quote, "If you believe that maintaining power and control and absolute freedom of movement and," listen to the word he used, "and sovereignty is important to your country's future," there's nothing inconsistent in that. We are the biggest, most powerful country in the world now. We've got the juice, and we're going to use it. But, Bill Clinton added a but if you believe that we should be trying to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in, when we are no longer the military, political, economic superpower in the world, then you wouldn't do that. It just depends on what you believe, unquote. So Bill Clinton is saying, let's prepare for a world that the West can't dominate, and let's strengthen multilateral institutions. That was incredibly wise advice from Bill Clinton. Guess what? He never repeated it again, and no one ever took up his idea. You can see, therefore, rationalism doesn't prevail. And that's why I may appear to you to be so pessimistic. So let me conclude this lecture by asking the obvious question. Against the backdrop of all that I have said, what should we do now? Should we give up and accept the current state of affairs driving us to lose the battle against climate change? Or should we continue to fight on? And here, I hope that we Asians will remember that we make up the bulk of humanity. The total population of Asians is 4.78 billion. We provide 59%, almost 60% of the world's population. Hence, clearly, we're going to suffer the most from climate change. Since we're going to suffer the most, we should also be the most outspoken. Fortunately, we have a good case to make. All we have to do is remind the West of their deep belief in rationalism and empiricism. And these two forces clearly dictate that all of humanity must set aside whatever differences they have, whether they be geopolitical, ideological, and focus on the most important common threat facing humanity, namely climate change. At the end of the day, we Asians, who number 4.78 billion people, must speak louder so that the 925 million people in the West can hear our views clearly and loudly. So I hope that my remarks today, if they're going to make any contribution, will encourage more Asians to speak more boldly about the greatest challenge facing humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, for the most insightful and thought-provoking lecture. May we invite you to remain on stage to receive the Gordon Arthur Ransome Gold Medal from the Master. Thank you, Master, and thank you, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our program this evening. The guest of honor and the stage party will now exit in procession.